This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is sexual ethics. I have Dr. Gina Jorgensen with me, and we will begin our conversation in a moment. Gina Jorgensen is my guest. She's a multi-talented woman. She's a sex educator. She's a dancer. She's a folklorist, fiction writer, poet, and a whole lot of other stuff, but we're going to be focusing mainly on talking about sexual ethics. Let me just ask you if you could give a little brief précis of who you are, Gina, and then we'll dig into things.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I did my undergraduate degree at UC Berkeley in interdisciplinary studies, which is one way of saying I was a folklorist there. They didn't have a folklore bachelor's at the time. I went to Indiana University for my master's and PhD in folklore. And since then, I've been bouncing around teaching at different universities in the Midwest. I did a stint back at UC Berkeley, and now I'm at Butler University in Indianapolis. And my research is not just on folklore. I do a lot with gender and sexuality and fairy tales, both traditional and contemporary. But I also research the history of sex education, gender roles in different cultures, storytelling and narrative more generally. And I am also a professional dancer and a poet and a writer and a blogger. So basically, I do a lot of things.
I know I mentioned to you before we started that I could do about a dozen shows with you, and hopefully we'll have a show in a couple of weeks with a few other people, and then also maybe in the new year, once you return from a trip you said you're going on, we can talk about your is it out your book? Was it Folklore 101?
Yes, it is
So I have yet
definitely
to read
happened.
it. I have a PDF, so I will get to it though in the next month or so, and we'll get to that at some time in the future. But before we get onto the sex stuff, I did mention to you that apparently Robert Bly, a well-known poet and the guy who helped to kickstart the men's movement over 3 decades ago, died in his sleep apparently on Sunday. And anyone who knows me knows I was not a big fan of Bly, not because of the men's movement stuff, but I think he was a poet who wasted his talent for fame and shallow pursuits. And I met him a few times. And But anyway, what was your take on Bly and his whole Iron John thing and its effects, good or ill, on folklore?
Yeah, I follow folklorist Jack Zipes in believing that Bly sort of mistakenly used the fairy tale. He wasn't working from a good translation of the Grimms. He changed things. He sort of reshaped the tale for his own purposes, which again, like people do. You know, folklore is common property. It's all of our intellectual and artistic heritage. But just the way that he chose to sort of tweak the tale to fit his men's movement agenda, I find sort of distasteful. And also, again, like from a folklore perspective, like if you're going to change things, at least say you're changing things or say you're taking creative license. And he sort of was pretending to have this ability to tap into some imaginary, authentic wellspring of masculine heritage, which I think is false. So most folklorists are not a huge fan of his work.
Yeah, we'll touch on that with Joseph Campbell in a couple of weeks when we talk about the monomyth and stuff. And I'm sure Joseph Campbell is probably even, in my opinion, at least within folklore and mythos, an even more baleful figure than Blythe. But
Yeah.
we wanted to talk. I wanted to talk about an assortment of sex stuff, but you wanted to focus more on sexual ethics. So, talk to me initially what you define as sexual ethics and why you wanted to speak of it. Because I always look at ethics as being secular, whereas I look at morals as being religious based.
Mhm. Okay, yeah. I mean, I can see that distinction. I think there's probably a lot of ways to distinguish between morals and ethics. Um, when I think of ethics, I agree they can be, often are secular. It's about how an individual relates to society, other individuals in that society, you know, social contracts type stuff that doesn't have to be derived from God or religion or whatever. Um, so I see sexual ethics as being sort of this sphere of people thinking about how they relate to themselves, you know, their own boundaries, their own sense of health, safety, things like that, pleasure, and also how they relate to others in terms of what is right and what is just, and again, health, public health, things like that. So one example from my research, because I study ethical non-monogamy, also called consensual non-monogamy. It's a big old umbrella term for all the ways in which people have simultaneous multiple non-monogamous relationships with one another, and how do you do that in such a way that it's consensual, all parties are on board, giving full informed consent, things like that. So I'm really interested in this topic because it's one that's been sort of stigmatized and looked down upon for a long time in this society and in others.
Well, let me just give a sort of example. I coined a term years ago called deliteracy, which, as opposed to illiteracy, is when people knowingly choose to not engage great literature or great art. They'd rather read, vampire tales than read Edgar Allan Poe. Rather read some crappy, sci-fi sword and sorcerer thing rather than Don Quixote. And in a similar way, I think ethics in general, and I think sexual ethics, there's a similar lack of engagement in society about this. And in reading up about you, I know you had written a number of times about your frustration with your particular line of work. I don't know if it's more just dealing with the institution of academia. And I do have a friend, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, named David Wall, PhD. He's a sex researcher. But um, what is your take on the current state of sex ethics as it's researched or propagated? Is it because we just don't think about these things that our sexual ethics are bad, or is this something that's just part of the human condition?
Yeah, that's a great question. My understanding is that it is really difficult to get funding for research on sexual topics. It is still very stigmatized. It's seen as sort of inappropriate in the academy, which is unfortunate because it's a facet of many people's lives. So I get the sense that it's typical. It's difficult to get funding. It's difficult to do longitudinal studies, which are really, amazing if you can get long-term data and follow up with people and stuff like that, even if it's just qualitative research like anthropological or sociological interviews. So a lot of my own research is about looking for clues about sexuality in the past, and this we can see them in folktales and legends and things like that. So I don't need to go through the institutional review board to get permission to do that if I'm studying dead people or textual evidence. Whereas if you do want to do field work, interviews, participant observation, that kind of thing with a living population, you have to go through the IRB or the institutional review board. And their job is to make sure that you're being ethical in your research, which is, again, a very important thing to do in research. But oftentimes there are a lot of holdups in studying sexuality, which is really unfortunate.
When you say ethics, do you mean that someone is studying or, let's say, doing research on a particular person's sexual problems and they become emotionally involved personally, or is it about gaming the system to get money versus another researcher? What do you mean by that?
Oh, yeah. So the history of the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB, is that back in like the 60s, 70s, and so on, this board didn't exist to make sure that researchers were being as ethically stringent as possible, not doing any harm to their patient or to their subjects, things like that. So classic example, if you know any psychological studies like the Milgram study,
Yeah.
where, yeah, so, but like the IRB would have probably said, hey, that could maybe traumatize somebody. Like, let's talk about that before you do it.
Or
Or
like the Stanford prison experiment is another example.
exactly. Yeah, so the idea is that there are certain populations that are vulnerable as well. Children, prisoners, things like that. People who are in some other way marginalized. So, we should be extra cautious as researchers to make sure that we're not going to potentially cause them harm by asking them to overextend themselves, or by potentially traumatizing them by asking about difficult questions. So it is a whole branch of research ethics that exists across the board in various fields, or in the medical sciences and biology and so on. If you're taking blood samples from people to study various whatever aspects of their biology, what happens to those samples? How long are they kept? Are they destroyed? Can someone's medical information be made public without their consent?
Yeah. And
So
yeah. And so does this also include work with like sex offenders? Because like very infamously, I think one of the great moments where I think things got a little off the rail was when Ted Bundy, in one of his last interviews, said that pornography made him a mass murderer and killer, thereby slagging a whole industry. Uh, and a lot of people went along with it because a lot of Puritans were like, see, we were right all along. Bundy confirms it, and it's like, well, he's not exactly the best guy you could get to make your case.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. So yeah, studying sex workers, or in a completely different category, sex offenders, or studying people's use of pornography. Because yeah, that example you bring up is a really interesting one. Like, we don't actually know very well how pornography impacts people because it's hard to study. Like, what are you going to do? Stick them in an MRI? I know of one researcher doing that, but she has faced a lot of criticism and, in fact, harassment from people who don't want her to be doing that research. So this just it's very complicated and multifaceted.
Well, let's just, since you brought that one point up about studying sex work, this would include prostitution, this would include pornography, and this would include, I guess, regular strippers. And from everything I've heard, although I've seen a few so-called studies that dispute it, sexual violence tends to go down when people have free access to watching movies on on their laptop, when they are able to buy sex, when they are able to, go and put some money in a G-string. Is that really under dispute? Because I always thought that that's pretty much a given.
Yeah, I'm not having any studies come to mind, but yeah, I mean, if nothing else, it is less dangerous for the sex workers themselves to not have it be illegal and to have the police coming in and doing stings and things like that. So I am fully in favor of decriminalization of sex work because, again, it makes it less dangerous for the sex workers themselves.
Yeah. Um, uh, and so let's talk then about more personal. What exactly, particularly, do you study, or is your main focus in sexual ethics? Is it sex workers? Is it violent offenders, or is it interpersonal stuff?
It's more interpersonal stuff. I try to stay informed about these other general topics just so I can have a conversation about them or bring them up in the college classroom when relevant. Um, but I'm really interested in, like I said, forms of ethical non-monogamy such as polyamory, swinging, kink, and BDSM, which sometimes fits under the ethical non-monogamy umbrella, and things like that. I'm also interested in, again, like how sexuality is thought of and framed in fairy tales and in folklore, because I think that, for all that these stories are seen as somewhat, oh, it's just trivial, oh, it's just entertainment, I think that they still give us a lot of clues to people's beliefs and behaviors.
Yeah, I saw some interviews that you had done previously, both written and uh, visual, audio visual. And uh, what do you, is there a particular, say, folklore or myth or legend that you use over and over to demonstrate a particular point about sexual ethics when you're teaching it?
Oh, it's a good question. Um, I'd have to say I come back a lot to the fairy tale Little Red Riding Hood
Mm.
because I feel like that one is a pretty good illustration of rape culture. So, Little Red Riding Hood, like most fairy tales, it exists in multiple versions. Who's the teller, who's the author? It's going to run around and be retold a bunch of times. So there's a lot of variation that occurs. And in the late 1690s, French aristocrat, sort of nobleman Charles Perrault, penned a version of Little Red Riding Hood in which she goes to grandmother's house. She meets the wolf along the way. Wolf goes and devours grandma before she gets there. She gets inside. She does essentially a striptease for the wolf because she's going to climb into bed with Granny, she thinks, for a nap or whatever. And, oh, what should I do with my frock? Throw it into the fire, my child. You won't need it anymore. And then she gets into bed and does the whole, Grandma, how big your eyes are, they better to see you with that whole thing. And the wolf eats her. And that's where the story ends. And Charles Perrault appends a moral because he really liked morals. His Cinderella has a moral, his Sleeping Beauty has a moral at the end, and so on, saying that young girls would do well to watch out for those wolves who are, in fact, smooth talkers and will follow them home into their salons, into their bedrooms, and eat them up. So this is clearly a tale about seduction, about rape, about sexual violence. And a lot of the discourse around this story is very much like, oh, but what did she do to deserve it? what does she do to invite this violence? Whereas in the Grimm's version, which came over a century later in the early 1800s, there's a woodcutter who comes and saves her and grandma, so it's all good. But the Charles Perrault version just has a sort of a tragic ending to be a warning to young ladies not to be too trusting.
Um, since you brought up the rape thing, let me just go back a bit and connect it with the idea of legalizing sex work, because anyone who knows me, and I think I might have mentioned it into one of my introductory emails, I grew up in what you would call sort of the Serpico taxi driver era of New York. And I think one of the things that I've always found, Taxi Driver is a great movie. I actually did a show on it. But one of the negatives I found is that the Jodie Foster stereotype became the de facto one of the things that was held up, just like with the Jane Roe who later came out against abortion. When the reality is, even back then in the 60s and 70s, at least here in the West, in the West, 90% or more of prostitution was never streetwalkers. It was people, from their own homes, people who, even going back to the pioneer days, had their cat houses. And if we were to accept, say, the premise that legalizing prostitution, porno, not that porno is illegal, but and destigmatizing it, and people, male and female, could engage more in their own lusts and desires, even if money is exchanged. Isn't that the ethical thing to do? And the reason I say so is, even putting aside what your religious belief is, I've never been, when I've known people, and I was in a gang as a kid who did quite a bit of sexual violence to people, it seems to me that the ethical thing is to lessen that. And so would that be an ethical component of that whole equation that's often missed?
Yeah, I think so. And I do want to be clear. I'm not a sex worker. I don't have experience with this. I don't want to speak for anyone. But when I listen in on conversations that sex workers are having, they're very clear about how this is a job just like any other job. It's all labor under capitalism. So yeah, just make it legal. It'll probably make it safer. It'll probably help out. I mean, I do want to point out there was one. Gosh, who wrote this piece? I think it might have been Jordan Peterson said something on the internet and
Oh
then
boy.
somebody else picked it up. But it was this idea that if we legalize sex work, it'll reduce violence, men's violence against women. And it's like, no, actually, that's a crappy take because you're just going to shunt violent men onto women who are getting paid for it. Like the problem is men's violence, not whether or not sex work is legal.
Well, now I'm gonna. It's interesting because everything you say brings up new things, which is a good way to talk, rather than just asking rote questions. Camille Paglia, I don't think much of her as an art critic, but when it comes to social criticism, I do agree with probably more of her opinions than not. And one of the things that I think modern feminism with a capital F gets wrong, and this might be controversial, I don't know what your opinion is that they'll say rape is about power. But having known guys who were violent scumbags in the world I grew up with, rape is mostly about sex for the guy. And if it weren't, then the equation that we just said about legalizing or blue, what we call it, not red light districts becoming or blue light districts, legalizing that stuff. Most of the lesser of violence, and especially sexual violence, would not happen. Would it not?
Yeah, so I'm really conflicted about that quote. Rape is not about sex; it's about power. Like I can kind of see that one going both ways depending on the situation. But I mean, the problem I think is, if you look at violent men who rape women, who are they choosing to rape? It does come back to power. It's people that they feel they have power over and that they can overpower. So I do feel like it is still a power issue. And that's part of why I'm trying to take sort of a holistic approach to sexual ethics and just thinking about, the society as a whole. So like, yes, if we legalize sex work, but then we don't fix other things that are broken in terms of bodily autonomy, agency, who has the right to sexual pleasure, it's still going to be kind of a broken system as a whole.
Yeah. So, an interesting term, bodily autonomy. This is one of the things that back 40 years ago, when I was about 16, 17, I remember escorting a girl into an abortion clinic. She wasn't a girlfriend. It wasn't my fetus there. But and I remember her being attacked, well, attempted to be attacked by people who were protesting it, and I defended her from one particular guy, and um, it's always kind of funny because the people who will talk the most about bodily autonomy, especially in this day and age with COVID and the masks and vaccine anti-vax stuff, are the people who are the first ones who want to take that away from women when it comes to things like their body. Is that a matter that you discuss in your classes as well?
Um, it's not something I bring up in my classes very often. The one exception is I'm teaching a class right now on the modern Middle East and North Africa, and it was in the kind of early weeks of the semester, and the U.S. was withdrawing from Afghanistan. And so there was all this sort of social media hubbub. And at the same time, Texas was enacting its very restrictive abortion laws, leading to people using the hashtag Texas Taliban,
Yeah.
which I thought was really interesting. So I brought that to class as an example of, hey, maybe this is some form of Orientalism, right? So degrading stereotypes about Middle Eastern people, making them out to be barbaric, savage, blah, blah, blah. Because, I think we should evaluate these really strict anti-abortion laws in the U.S. on their own merit within their own framework of Christian white supremacy. Like, don't bring the Middle East into this. Like, evaluate them on their own standards as well. Which, as I brought into class that day, some of the research shows that Islam actually permits abortions in many circumstances, same as Judaism. And it really just kind of depends on the local interpretation of Islamic law or Sharia law. So it turns out that in Afghanistan specifically, there are some penalties for abortions. Those are harsh. Those are probably not great. But the real issue is poverty. A lot of Afghan women live in dire poverty. They don't have access to good medical care. So the maternal mortality rate is really, really high. So that's what the conversation should be about rather than this little quip, Texas Taliban. So I'm all for just, like more context, trying to get a deeper understanding, looking at cultural values, again, in their own context.
Yeah, it's interesting. Poverty. I was just arguing with someone on another website a few days ago. They were talking about why is there so much garbage in black neighborhoods, and I'm like, what the fuck who really worries about this kind of thing? I mean, if you look at poverty and poverty rates around the world, whatever group, whatever in whatever country, the people who are at the bottom of the ladder are going to have the most problems in education and health and whatever, violence, crime. And more often than not, that's based upon ethnicity of some sort. But yeah, I mean, here in Texas, if they worried more about actually being able to clean a couple of inches of snow off the road rather than women's bodies. So, Gina, a few years ago, I did a show on polygamy, and the fellow I spoke with, a fellow named Joe Henrik, had written a book about it, and he went back through the centuries, the eons, looking at stuff going back before in the BC world up through the Khans and even into today with the stuff out in Utah and the Mormons and all that stuff. And his conclusion was that polygamy was a bad thing, but not because of what you might think. He came up with the idea that polygamy was bad because when one man is able to scoop up more women than others, it leaves a lot of angry, sexually frustrated males in society. And when you have a lot of angry, frustrated males in society, a lot of shit goes down. So, speaking of polyamory or polygamy or whatnot, are you then? Have you ever seen any research or done any research or about levels of violence when it comes to polyamory or polygamy versus monogamy?
Yeah, I know there's a little bit of that research out there. I haven't looked at it much myself. So the interesting thing, and I teach this some of my college classes as well, polygamy is actually the broad term that means one can have multiple marital partners. What we're talking about with one man with multiple wives is polygyny,
Yeah.
whereas one woman with multiple husbands is polyandry.
Yeah.
And we know from global anthropological research that polyandry is extremely rare. I think like less than 10% of the world's cultures have it even as a possibility on the table. Polygyny, specifically with multiple wives, is very common. Something
Mm.
like three-quarters of the world's cultures at least have it as a possibility. Like not everybody's doing it in that culture, but it's a possibility. So the first off, just the gender imbalance is really interesting there. So again, I don't think it's polygamy that's inherently a problem. It's polygyny that is often religiously motivated. And again, like I would view this as sort of the same thing as in our sex work conversation. Like I don't know that this practice is inherently bad, but if it's happening in a system with really broken gender roles, that's going to taint it in a way. That's
Mm.
going to mean it's also kind of broken. And I do think that the previous comment about it leading to more potential riled up, sexually frustrated young men, that viewpoint still kind of posits women as possessions. Like if
Yeah.
this guy could only get a woman as though she were something he went and bought at Target, he wouldn't be so violent. I was like,
Yeah.
that's it's not women's problem to fix violent men. I don't know. I don't know what to do with that one.
Yeah. I my take on his take was that, okay, even if I accept what you're saying is correct, I don't know if it's worth giving up the personal liberty of individuals to choose to be able to be in those kinds of relationships. You know, where, you know, and this gets back to now here during the COVID era, where does one's rights infringe upon someone else's or the society's right to have a healthy populace?
Hmm. Yeah, well, one interesting difference between these traditional marriages that are polygynous in nature and modern day consensual non-monogamy like polyamory is that polygyny is really only ever, for the most part, one man with multiple wives. Polyamory, on the other hand, the gender configuration could be anything that people prefer, and there's a whole range of relationship structures, and like we could draw like crazy diagrams all day. Triad, quad, open, closed. Like there's a whole like polyfidelity, meaning that you're only dating or sleeping with the people in your little network, but you can't go have a fling with somebody else. There are so many ways it gets structured, which is really interesting. And now some of them end up being sort of restrictive and unequal as well. So within the polyamory community, there is sort of an infamous phrase, the one penis policy, or the OPP. And that is when usually it's a man and a woman who are dating, and the woman is often bisexual. So the guy will tell her, oh, you can have other partners, but you can only date other women.
Hmm.
The OPP, there can only be
Yeah.
one set of male genitals in the relationship, which is, I think it's problematic for a lot of reasons. I think it's kind of biphobic. Like it tells her that her bisexuality is only valid in certain outlets. I think it's sort of, oh, what's the word I'm looking for? It sort of puts women's relationships with each other on like a lower status. Like, oh, well, you can have these other, I'm not threatened by these other relationships. It's only a guy who's really a threat to what you and I have, kind of a thing. It's a very, very bizarre sort of patriarchal logic. So you'll see a lot of discussion of the OPP in non-monogamous communities, which again is sort of modeled on old school polygynous or polygamous marriages.
So let's talk then. Let's stay in this general subject of polygyny and its variants for a while here. I know, as myself, as a monogamous heterosexual guy, for me, uh, you know, even if there were 1,000 naked dancing Halle Berrys and Playboy playmates, I might lust in my heart, as Jimmy Carter once uh, famously said in an interview. But for me, I guess it's always about co-experience, that you're building a bond with a particular person. Um, uh, if that's so, if you're involved in even say a 4 or 5 group uh, pairing, or not pairing, it wouldn't technically bonding. Uh, can you really have the same level of intimacy? And isn't that what most people are really talking about when they're talking about fidelity? Not necessarily sticking your dick in a hole, but that you have an emotional bond with one individual.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a really fantastic book called Swinging in America. I want to say Curtis Bergstrand and Jennifer Sinsky that came out gosh, at this point, a good few years ago, and they conducted research with swingers and interviews and everything, and they talked about there actually being three levels of monogamy or non-monogamy, or three aspects to it. One is emotional. This is love, romance, your feelings for the other person. The other is sexual. So again, who are you sexually active with, just one person or many? And then the other is practical, and this is sort of unique to the American experience since the last mid-century or so, where you're expected to sort of marry one person, house, white picket fence, 2.5 kids and a dog. You're expected to share life's daily practical domestic tasks with one and only one person. And this goes counter to much of human history. When people lived in extended households, they had these large kinship, familial networks. You weren't kind of just stuck dividing up all the tasks of life with only one person. So if you look at these three different aspects, emotional, sexual, and practical monogamy, you'll see that people kind of have always toggled these things slightly differently. And I agree, for a lot of people in sort of more like common monogamous relationships, there is both a sexual and an emotional component that they want to like safeguard and keep as like, this is intimate, this is just for us, this is important to us. And I think for a lot of people who choose some form of ethical monogamy, they have to ask themselves those questions, because in monogamy, those are your default settings. You don't really have to talk about it because it's assumed. You see it in pop culture, movies, novels, like every single thing, every single aspect of culture, as well as institutions, like, if you're married, you pay different taxes, reinforces monogamy as the norm. So if you step outside that norm, you have to really decide like, well, I'm okay with this level, but not that. Like, we can, a lot of swingers, for example, will say, we have these rules for playing with others and we all have fun, sexy times in whatever conditions, but you come home with me at the end of the night, or you don't have relationships with the other people, we just have flings. Whereas people on the more polyamorous end of the spectrum, or people who are solo poly, I mean, they don't have a primary partner, they just kind of date whoever, or people who are more relationship anarchy, they might toggle the settings differently and say, I'm fine with you having an emotional connection with someone else under these circumstances, or not at all, or somewhat. So there's a lot of variability there.
So with any polygamous kind of relationship, since human beings are tribal, if let's say I was in a relationship with 4 other people, 5 other people, it's a 5-some or a 6-some, would that necessarily extend my sphere of the tribe larger, since those people might also, unbeknownst to me, have their own little circles and circles? Does that make the circles bigger, or does that increase the rates of jealousy or envy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So part of it also depends on if people are closeted or able to be open. I think this is sort of like a new frontier
When
for
you say
U.S.
closeted, are
culture.
you talking simply about homosexuality or closeted in another way?
Closeted as poly.
Okay,
So the
okay.
word has become sort of borrowed into this subculture as well. So yeah, so with in terms of being gay, lesbian, bisexual, and so on, there's a lot more openness. You don't have to be as closeted necessarily for like workplace reasons and so on. But for people who choose some form of ethical non-monogamy, many of them will identify as being closeted because they don't know if they'll be seen as kind of like immoral or slutty or whatever by the people in their lives, like at their workplace or their family. So that is one consideration here. One thing about sexual ethics, kind of bringing it back to that topic, is this idea of bodily autonomy and consent. Like, you can't force your partners to do something, but you can choose what happens to you in your own body. So you can tell your partners, hey, I would just like a heads up if you're sleeping with somebody else, and like the level of sexual contact, who's using what kind of protection, blah, blah, blah. But you can't necessarily control or force it on their end. You can make the agreement, and so you can control what happens to you as a result. It gets really murky. But yeah, to answer your question, sometimes people have these extended networks of lovers that just kind of keep cascading. And other times it's a very deliberate closed, like let's say somebody is in a closed quad where there's 4 people and they're dating each other and nobody has any outside partners and they agree on it. And having an outside partner at that point would constitute cheating in the same way that one could cheat on a monogamous relationship.
And within a multiple union pairing, uh, are there specific rules in general, or does each one make their own? For example, if you have 2 women and 2 men, if the guy decides he wants to suck the other guy's dick, is that breaking the rule? It could only be he can only be with the women, or vice versa.
I mean, it depends on the people in that configuration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what generally has been the history of poly relationships versus governments? Because when I did interview that fellow some years ago about polygamy, my argument was that this is what in 2017, so it's just a couple of years after gay marriage became legal here in the U.S. My argument was, boy, if I'm into polyamory or polyandry or polygamy or polygyny, that this should be the time when I would get the lawyers and because I can't see how anyone could say, well, if two women or two guys can be married, why can't it be legally speaking extended? Because I think one of the great legal triumphs of the last 100 years was how quickly gay marriage came. Because I figured when in '05, when they first filed it, it would be 25 years minimum. It would be 2030 before it would happen. And inside of 10 years, because of if you read the legal arguments and whatnot, they just went like a laser and showed all of the fallacies that weren't in law that a lot of people thought were institutionalized in U.S. law. So, what is your take about that, the legal aspects of poly?
Yeah, I think that's a conversation a lot of people in the US aren't ready to have. I think that one of the ways in which
But why?
that's
But why? I mean, we've had the conversation about
yeah.
homosexuality. Why?
So here's the
Yeah.
thing. I think one of the reasons why gay marriage was legalized as quickly as it was, as you said, was that there's still this envisioning of the couple. Like
Uh,
the couple is this unit, the fundamental unit of society. Because once you're a couple, you buy a house, you either have or adopt children, or you choose not to, but you stay connected in your community. I don't think we're ready for the conversation about units other than couples. I think that's for a few reasons. I think some of it is just straight up like sex negativity and sex shaming. I think this idea that anybody who has multiple partners is inherently duplicitous, slutty, like all of these really negative attributes that carry moral connotations, even though there's no valid reason to have these connections. So I don't think we're ready for that conversation at all.
is it because they look at poly relationships as some kind of gateway to say bestiality? Like if you want to sleep with your best friend's husband's gardener, then a mule must be not far behind.
Yeah, I mean, there could be some slippery slope, sort of logical fallacy happening here. Again, I think that there is an inherent distaste for excessive forms of sexuality in American culture, and multiple partners definitely would count as excessive. I mean, this goes back to like our Puritan roots and things like that. There's just an inherent sex negativity to our culture. Like superficially, sex sells, so we get visual representations of sexy things all the time, but on an actual like judgmental level, I think we're extremely sex shaming, sex negative, intolerant people.
So I want to talk a little bit about actual how research is conducted into most sexual things, and I want to another little term I came up with myself is what I call the zookeeper fallacy, and I want to just briefly explain it and then see if it's applicable to sex research. So I came up with this idea of the zookeeper fallacy that, and because I was once in a gang, I often get I don't like the way a lot of people will talk about gangs. They still have a lot of they don't understand the sort of bonding that goes on within gangs, male or female. But anyway, the idea is that let's say that you're hired as a zookeeper and you're going to take care of the lions, and the lions that you take care of for 20, 25 years are as domesticated as can be. They're old, they're toothless, they're fat, and you can even have a little bit of engagement and not fear these lions. And then one day, 25 years later, you're about to retire, you'd say, I want to go on a safari to Africa. I want to see what the wild lions are like. So you pay your money, you go to Africa, you're on the safari, you're on the tour. And because you've taken care of lions for 20, 25 years, you think you know more about lions than anyone else. So the first lion out there, you get out of the car and you walk up there and you think it's just like the old lions do, and you get mauled to death. And to me, I call this the zookeeper fallacy, because often when researchers, and not just sex, I mean, I think with physics and dark matter and a lot of things in the sciences, a lot of people mistake things that their little sphere for being the whole thing. And in this context with sex research, I've often seen that a lot of it is dependent on self-reportage, and I think that's rife for a lot of, if I'm saying, well, I really slept with 7 women, but I slept with 78 women is what I put. Well, my dick is 4 inches, but I say it's 13 inches or what. There's that kind of kind of bruiting of things that what the researchers want to hear. So how do they distinguish that when people are doing research like that?
Yeah, that's a really thorny issue. So yeah, so one of the ways that sex research has been conducted is by asking people to keep diaries, do journaling, self-reporting, essentially, which is inherently flawed. So yeah, this is why I mentioned earlier, longitudinal studies are really amazing when you can get the funding and get the permission and find a way to contact somebody year after year after year. Because if you establish some sort of like friendly, trusting relationship, like as a researcher and subject with someone, you're more likely to get honesty. Whereas you just do like a scattershot series of surveys or interviews, there's no guarantee that you're getting that honesty. And I agree, because sex is still a very taboo and shameful topic in the U.S. People are already motivated to maybe exaggerate or twist the truth, or they don't want to get slut shamed for having so many partners, so they'll change the number or whatever. So yeah, it is a very problematic issue in sex research. But I mean, like, what's the alternative? You try to like have people in the lab to do sexy things. That's also rife with problems. Um, so yeah, there aren't a lot of good answers here, except for, again, having very transparent research design and trying to be as like straightforward and ethical as possible in how you approach people, building trust, building a relationship, that kind of thing.
Well, I this just came to mind as you said that. Now, I've seen sleep studies where people, they go into a lab and they sleep. And I have heard rarely of when people have agreed to engage in sex while there are cameras going on, not for pornography, but within in laboratories. I don't know uh, how rife that is now, but I mean, obviously, you couldn't study, for example, if two people are engaging in sex, whether it's homosexual sex, heterosexual sex, or polysex, or whatever. You can't really engage with their minds, but is that kind of research done? For example, if we're going to research, say, erectile dysfunction, or why women sometimes are too dry during sex when they should be. Um, isn't that the best way to do it when you actually can physically detect something, or does that not go on now?
Yeah, no, there have been some studies. So give me homework for next time so I can look up all the studies in
Oh,
advance. So there have definitely been some studies. One of the more interesting things to come out of this type of physiological study is what's called concordant versus non-concordant arousal. Dr. Emily Nagoski writes about this in her excellent book on sex, which I am totally blanking on the name. Give me like 1 second. Oh, Come As You Are. That's right. So Dr. Emily Nagoski's book, Come As You Are, she writes about this. So concordant arousal means that you are feeling physical signals in your body that say, ooh, sexy times, I'm aroused. And your brain is like, yeah. Non-concordant arousal is when your brain is like thinking about something else and your body's like, sexy times. So concordant arousal, brain and body in agreement. Non-concordant, there's a divergence for whatever reason. And so they figure this out by basically hooking people up in a lab to measure blood flow to their genitals. And then they had them watch images and scenes. And they noticed this kind of interesting difference between men and women. Men would be watching something that they would classify as a sexy image or a sexy scene, and they would have blood flow to their genitals and be like, oh, I feel aroused. Yeah, brain, I'm also aroused. So that's concordant arousal. Women, on the other hand, had far higher rates of non-concordant arousal. They would be shown kind of like random things like chimpanzees having sex, and their brain would be like, yeah, no, and their body would respond. So the main like take home here from this is that non-concordant arousal is not particularly well understood, but it's also not unhealthy or broken. It's another way that people experience sexuality. If your body is like, I'm getting signals, and your brain is like, really? It's really common in women, and a lot of women, I think, as a result, feel sort of like broken, or like, oh, arousal is hard for me to kind of get into the mood. It's like, no, you're just wired a little differently. It's okay.
I want two points to end this segment, and then I want to talk about gender, transgender, and gender roles in the next one. But I did an interview about a year and a half ago that a lot of people were like, "What the fuck are you interviewing this guy?" There was a fellow who wrote a book about having a sexual relationship with a dolphin, zoophilia, back in the late '60s or '70s. Now, I don't know if this was so. He wrote the book. He was a very interesting guy, very personable guy. He seemed, if I were a drinker, I wouldn't mind having a drink in the bar with him. But uh, it got me to thinking that uh, the odd ways that human sexuality is, and I want to compare this to other animals. Now, speaking of dolphins, dolphins are famously sexually predacious themselves. They often rape other pods, females. They will often kill or rape porpoises, who are smaller uh, uh, whales than themselves. And it seems to me that sexual arousal has a lot to do with the size of the brain. I don't think there are going to be a lot of kinky crocodiles or, perverse cockroaches. It seems once you get into the higher animals, the elephants, the whales, the great apes, bonobos, for example, human beings, that the brain can diverge more and it gets turned on more sexually or otherwise. And it brings up the idea of, is Homo sapiens really Homo sexus?
Yeah, I agree. Human brains, we are so good at telling ourselves stories and then either believing them or disputing them. Like we have very active imaginations, very active storytelling capacities, interesting relationship to like empathy and things like that, and desire for connection, and desire for belonging. So yeah, I think that human sexuality is really complicated because we have so much going on, and then we have culture as another factor that gives us all this baggage. So, like, what do you do with the baggage? You get turned on because something is taboo? Do you shy away from it? There's zillions of responses to the sort of, unique mix that we have as humans.
And it's interesting you bring up taboos because violence, at least non-consensual violence, is almost never considered taboo by a lot of cultures, whereas other things, you know, let's say like the zoophilia that this fellow did, or claims to have done, or other things aren't. Why do you think that the taboos about sex are they mostly based upon procreative ideas? Are they mostly based upon pleasure ideas? And if procreation and pleasure are somehow taboo in sex, well, what the fuck is sex for then? It's just violence?
Yeah, no, I mean, unfortunately, I think the lack of taboo on violence is it's not a bug, it's a feature. I think in patriarchal societies there are a lot of deeply ingrained ideas in people about how like men have the right to women's bodies, men have the right to pleasure. Do women have the right to pleasure? Jury's out. So I think there's a lot of ingrained ideas about facilitating men's experiences and neglecting women's experiences that just kind of have become the background noise of our culture. But yeah, I do think a lot of taboos are about controlling people essentially. Like we I think we should have more taboos against non-consensual type things. And then the question of whether animals can consent is also kind of a bizarre and interesting question I don't feel entirely prepared to tackle. But yeah, I think a lot of taboos are sort of old-fashioned control mechanisms.
Yeah, there's a British director, Steve. Oh, he's got the same name as a famous Hollywood actor, a black fellow who won for 10 Years a Slave. Um, I forget his name, but he did a movie in 2011 called Shame, a great movie, one of the best movies of the last 20 years, in which the main actor um, is a sex addict. But the movie isn't about sex addiction. It's about his loneliness and what propels him to it. And there's a scene of him walking around his apartment naked, and he takes a piss, and you can see his schlong. And it's like the human body doesn't always have to be about sex. Part of the symbolism of that is he's totally revealed. You see him walking around his apartment naked. He takes a piss. He's looking up porno. He may be engaged in sex, but we as the viewers are not going to be looking at him. And do you think there's a disconnect that human beings find it difficult to deal with anything with the human body and it not being about sex? It could be about loneliness. It could be about the ravages of age. It could be about any number of dozens of things, but we are just focused on sex to our own detriment.
Yes, I completely agree. There's a college class I teach. I love it's an anthropology upper division course called The Body and Society. And one of our main class concepts is somatophobia, or the fear and loathing and disgust of the body. So I think we have a very somatophobic culture here in the modern West, in America in particular, in that we are disgusted by our own bodies so much of the time. And further, if we do engage with them, it's like, oh, well, it has to be a sex thing because how could we possibly contemplate our bodies and their wholeness and their humanity?
Hmm. It was Steve McQueen. The movie was Shame 2011. Michael Fassbender was the actor. Just as I was breaking and checking what we had just been speaking about, I just want to take a little break because I hope to speak to you again in the future, not only about Campbell and your own book. Um, I just want to bring up an idea that I just wonder if in your studies you've come across. John Keats, and I mentioned this to a woman I interviewed about 7, 8 months ago. John Keats has this idea called negative capability, in which you can bring two disparate ideas or things that no one's ever thought of before. You bring them together in some kind of artistic work, and then boom, it's like they were always there. And people are like, well, of course it was. And I think that's one of the key things with myth and creativity as well, and it can also occur in science. I'm wondering if you had ever heard of that and what you did. And again, this is just a brief diversion from the sex talk. We'll get back.
I'm drawing a blank.
Okay. All right. Well, so I wanted to talk then about gender and transgender and stuff like that. One of the more interesting quotes I saw someone write on a blog that when they were arguing about that topic was that they said very simply that sex is physical and gender is metaphysical. So what is your take on that in general? And then we'll go from there.
Yeah, I mean that's how we tend to use the terms in feminist and queer studies as sort of a basic intro 101 level, which is that sex is biological, anatomical, genetic in nature. So what are your chromosomes? But the problem is that like sex is not a binary even because there are so many different chromosomal and hormonal conditions you can have that might cause you to be intersex. Roughly 1% of the population is intersex. So, if we're trying to build this whole binary, male or female, they're so different all the time, but like the data is like, yeah, no, it's not universal. So I feel like even this idea that sex is a physical anatomical thing that you can measure and quantify, that's not true. Archaeologists sometimes have trouble sexing the skeletons that they find unless they have a really broad, I guess you look out and find a bunch of skeletons, because one skeleton in isolation may not be enough to tell you this is a male or female skeleton. Like there are certain physiological differences that are probably present in most people most of the time, like, with the hips and whatever, but it's not universal. So even this idea that sex is physical, it's like, well, yes, and it's always going to be like a hair more complex than that. There's also some studies showing that there's a cultural way in which our anatomical sex is shaped. Because in some cultures, having boys is more valued than having girls. Boys get fed more. They get bigger because of how they're fed. So it's complicated. But yeah, this idea that gender is metaphysical, it's social, it's more identity focused. Like, yeah, I completely agree. Gender is the overlay onto sex or counter to sex or in a complicated relationship with sex that is more sort of socially conditioned and more like what we make it.
So I know that I've looked at various websites will say dozens, some will say a few hundred. I think the largest number of quote unquote genders that I saw was one site had 312 or 317. And I think a lot of the thing that happens is this is the kind of thing that turns off a lot of society because it just seems ludicrous, especially when people just have MTF or FTM surgery. And how does one become a furry? If this was on par with being male or female, so I mean, what at what point are we talking about sexuality, and what point are we talking about ideas of sexuality? It's the difference between, say, I mentioned I was in a car accident where a deer ran down my car. I mean, outran it and just threw itself at it. Now, that's that real incident that happened. But then there's also my own personal mythology. If I'm nervous driving a car or I tell someone about it in 10 years, it will expand. So where do we draw the line between what has happened, what is, and what people simply perceive, pro or con?
Yeah. So one point of clarification, gender and sexuality, we do use those differently. Gender is more about identity, how you express that, what you wear, blah, 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 all those things, how you identify. Sexuality is more about orientation, attraction, general erotic type things. And so, of course, your gender and sexuality don't necessarily have any bearing on each other. Like I know that the word transsexual was used for a long time for what we would now call transgender people. So I think that that adds some confusion. But yeah, but for most people, their gender is kind of it is what it is, and then the sexuality it might be related to their gender. For a lot of people, sexuality is relational in some sense. Like, oh, if I am a female sexed person with a feminine gender identity and I want to be attracted to someone who I perceive as different than me, so I'm attracted to a masculine type person. In that sense, your gender might influence your sexuality because it's relational, saying I am this thing and I want this other thing. But there's no inherent link between the two. Like you can be any gender and have any sexuality without there being a natural assumed link. So does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to talk. People often think in monolithic terms. Um, Obviously, if people think all black people are going to be more liberal in this country, the U.S., or this or that, but we clearly see that there are people who, I mean, there are black bigots, there are gay bigots, and there isn't this monolith. For example, in black society, there's colorism. And I'm old enough to remember back in the 70s and 80s where there was a lot of tensions between lesbians and gay males in terms of political power and whatnot. And I want to talk about a couple of things that I recently read online just to get your the take on them. One is you mentioned transsexual and now transgender, and someone I read an article online a month or so ago, probably before I even came upon you online, about the missing trans, meaning transvestites, and that is these are men who are by their own declaration fully heterosexual. They don't have any homosexual leanings. They just like to wear women's clothes, panties, this and that, and yet what do they fit into that sphere, the LGBT, whatever, etc., or are they outre?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my sense is again, if their gender identity is one of like, I was assigned male at birth, I am a man, I identify as a man, and this is my hobby, then part of me is like, okay, sure, you do you. But I feel like it's not necessarily the same as being in the LGBTQ umbrella if you're not going to potentially face discrimination, harassment, violence, even just people stereotyping you in kind of nasty ways. And so I do suspect that transvestites might get some negative stereotyping coming their way. So yeah, I don't know. That's a tough case study. Like I know people like that. I know those people exist. So it's like LGBTQ identity umbrella or not. I don't actually know what I think about that one.
Another article that I read, and I think it was from a San Francisco publication, I really found it odd, was that apparently there's been an almost total shutdown of lesbian bars in the last 15, 20 years. And the reporter who was doing it spoke to some people who used to own some of the bars, and their take was that now a lot of young lesbians are all being told that they're really trans men, and they need to get over their hang-ups and come out as themselves and whatnot. It's just one of those kind of just so oddly specific kind of things that have you ever heard of anything like that, or I don't know.
Yeah, I saw something similar to that online. I don't think that's really a thing. I don't think anyone is declaring themselves the lesbian police and going around and telling young lesbians you're actually a trans guy. I don't see that happening. I think it's kind of a little transphobic urban legend running around. I don't think that's a thing. I mean, I do agree. Like I have heard that lesbian bars are closing. I think that's a bummer. I think that queer spaces for women are sadly few, but I don't know what to do about that.
So I did want to, before I get off the topic, I did want to say, so you use the term, and it's a term that's used a lot, the assigned term at birth. That often puts a pejorative, it seems to me, on the doctors. And just to give you to pull it out, I read an article about a woman who was suing a doctor who told her that she needed to lose weight, and that she had claimed that the doctor had been, I guess, fat phobic, you might call it, in doing so. And I'm just wondering, when you use a term like a sign, that does seem. I mean, if the doctor, gets, or the midwife gets the baby, and it's got a penis, or it doesn't have a penis, and what, I don't think they're really assigning. They're just taking what the sex is at the time. The very term assigned seems to me kind of conspiratorial, that somehow people are against that. And it's certainly, even if it's the term itself is neutral, it's used generally in that conspiratorial kind of way, as if someone did something negative to me. What is your take, just etymologically, on the word and its usage as it's evolved over, well, let's say, this century?
Yeah, so I do view it in a neutral light, and part of the reason for that is that the whether you check the M or the F box on various paper, it's just a category. Like it's a category that you're assigned, and then you have to check the box on a zillion forms. Even though I have no idea, why is it on my driver's license? Why does that matter? Why is it on my passport? Like, do they really need to know if I have ovaries when I'm traveling to another country? Like, it just kind of baffles me. So it's like, okay, well, clearly this category is important to some people. Okay, it's a box you check. It's just you get assigned. Like I view it as a very neutral term personally. I view it as also it's useful for people if they are trying to maybe discover if they are intersex or something like that. Because I don't know about you, but I haven't had any chromosomal testing done. I'm assuming I'm XX chromosome, so I don't know for sure. So I just feel like there are a number of scenarios where it's useful to say, like, this is just a box that got checked and it has some uses, like in terms of biological differences between most men and most women. Like, yeah, if that F box is checked, I should be checked out for ovarian cancer. If your M box is checked, even if it's no longer checked because you transitioned to a woman, you should probably get checked for prostate cancer. But apart from some highly specific physiological things, I don't see there being a purpose to need to check an M or F box on every damn form of our lives. So I just, again, for me, assigned is it's a neutral thing. Here's a medical category, we put you in it. Okay.
Well, how about when they do the census, as they did last year? Certainly, for example, ethnically speaking, a lot of money can get assigned or not assigned to a certain community if you don't report, if you report a wrong, if you're very pale skinned Hispanic and you identify as white, but the rest of your family identifies as Hispanic, there's a lot of stuff in terms of social good that can come of that. Is there? What is your take? But that
Yeah.
wouldn't apply regarding sex stuff for the
Well,
census.
and see, I agree with you there too. And this is the rub of like all identity politics. The paradox at the heart of all activism is we got lumped together into this group, like it or not. We may or may not actually have that much common with each other, but we're being marginalized or oppressed or targeted for virtue of this group membership. We may not even like this group that much in the first place. So, like, what do you do with that? So, yes, I completely agree. Having ways to have identifiers tagged onto people is a really useful way to gather information as a researcher or as an activist. But yeah, it is sort of this question at the heart of a lot of social justice movements is people are not monolithic categories, right?
Mhm.
So how do we deal with that? It's complicated.
One of the things, and I don't know if you've ever noticed this, because I want to transition away from just purely this more sex stuff and sort of go into sort of the grayer area of sex and folklore. One of the things I noticed as a boy, and again, I don't know if you ever noticed, is that the way males and females talk to each other. Let's say that you were with a girlfriend of yours at some bar, and you're talking about, oh, there's a cute guy, and I don't know if you're straight or bi or whatnot, but let's assume that you're straight for this purpose, and you're there with Gina and Susie, and women will look eye to eye. They'll be like, "Girl, that guy, don't like him. He treated me bad. Don't you go out with his friend." And they'll look eye to eye. They'll get that bond. With men, it's the other way. Men are like at the ballpark, sitting next to each other, and they're like, "I'll tell you, Sam, this girl had the best tits I've ever seen," and they're looking off into the ether, imagining the best rack they've ever imagined. Um, so number one, do you agree that there are certain, if not that, have you noticed that? Do you agree that there are some certain sexual or gender things that are specific, and are where comes some of the gray in between?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of linguistics research on this actually, which I find really fascinating. I think a lot of it's just social conditioning. The genders, the two-ish genders in the US are socially conditioned to talk very differently. If you've ever listened to a woman pepper her sentences with "I'm sorry,"
Yeah,
sorry, sorry. Oh,
yeah,
it drives me crazy. But it's just acculturation. I mean, people in different cultures speak in vastly different ways, not just like I'm speaking a different language, but habits, gestures, all that stuff is learned. So yeah, we have learned gender differences in how we speak in the US, but I don't think it's universal.
yeah. Before we go on from the gender stuff, there was one thing I just missed, and I wanted to talk about the term turf that I never heard of until about six,
Mm.
7, 8 months ago, and um, I think. I think, for example, when people talk about the bathroom stuff, it's like, to me that's silly, because if I got to take a shit, I don't care if you got the cameras of the world on me and I'm in the middle of New York and 4 billion people are watching me. If I got a shit, I'm going to take a shit. You know. By the same token, I have encountered some people, and I think, for example, some of the arguments about sports having what we call trans women play with in sports with women, or cis women, if you want to call it. I think that has some merit, because I have seen, for example, some videos that are around of like boxers or MMA fighters who are trans women just beat the shit out of clearly smaller females that really didn't have a chance. Do you think that there needs to be, say, a third way, male, female sports, trans sports, because you don't really see trans men who were born female trying to compete against men. There's a famous thing where Serena Williams, back around the turn of the century, is considered the greatest female tennis player of all time, but she got her ass killed at the height of her power by a guy who was ranked like 230th in there. So I mean, there are some physical things. What is your take on the whole sports thing? Because that to me is the real issue, is women getting hurt. And I think someone like Rowling probably didn't express it well, but I don't think that she's an outright bigot the way you might think of a Klansman. Do you?
I think she's pretty bigoted. Um, Yeah, so the sports thing is complicated, but like I said, like with the example of sexing skeletons, even very talented archaeologists need to see a range of bodies from a culture in a time period to have a sense of like, oh, this might be a male or a female skeleton. So I think there's so much natural range in human bodies. But like some people are just born really, really tall, and that gives them an advantage of basketball or whatever. So I just, and I think that again, like hormones play a huge influence on how the body develops, and that they have hormones again have a very clear, persistent, aggressive influence on the bodies of people who are transitioning. So I think it's a bit of a logical fallacy to assume that it's going to be like basically someone who's born as a male and assigned male at birth, and then just like stick a wig on them and throw them into box. I don't think that's what's happening at all. So I think that the conversation is being kind of oversimplified, and it's missing the fact that there's already so much natural diversity in human bodies. And like gender is just one of the boxes we would put on people to identify them. There's also height. There's also, do you have more fast twitch or slow twitch muscles and things like that. So as far as having a third league, I mean, again, like I don't want to speak for trans people, but I'd only be in favor of that if it protects trans people from other people's bigotry. Um, I don't know. Like I don't see this as a huge problem personally, but I don't know. I don't want to speak for anyone, and I think that it's more complicated than it appears on the surface.
So I want to wrap up the next 10, 20 minutes, or whatever it takes, and I want to just move away from sex based, but how sex affects, say, myth and folklore. Um, I think that sex and sexuality probably is the most personal kind of folklore you can have, because, as I mentioned, when if I talk with my friends, male or female, and you mention a past lover, or you mention a past problem you had, or you had an abortion, or this or that, we all try to put our spin on things, usually to our favor. And I wonder, what do you think role sex not as the topic of folklore, but sex and the brooding of one's own sexuality. Is that generative, one of the generative forces of folklore?
Yeah, interesting question. I would say so. Yeah. So, in the examples you gave, those are personal narratives, right? Formative experiences you've had that make a good story. So you retell the story and embellish a little bit over time. Everybody has these stories. So personal narratives, jokes. I think we have a lot of slang words about sex. There are lots of urban legends and beliefs about sex. So some of the horrible ones I've heard, for example, include things like if you douche with Coca Cola after sex, you won't get pregnant.
Oh man.
Do not recommend. Do not do that. So yeah, like sex weaves in and out of our folklore on a constant basis. And again, this is one of those things that academics have typically been a little too prude to study, unless maybe you have the protections of tenure. So yeah, it is a really fascinating topic, and there are even really sort of raunchy folk tales and fairy tales that a lot of people haven't heard of, thanks to like the Disneyfication of the fairy tale genre,
Yeah.
associating it with children and children alone. So yeah, there are versions of classic fairy tales where there is sex and it's not always consensual. But this is because in the past, past centuries, fairy tales were told by and for adults, and kids were like a common audience too. But back before TV, back before Netflix, back before widespread literacy, people told stories, traditional stories, to entertain themselves, and often they were just a little raunchy.
Yeah. I want to give a little tale of a friend of mine from years ago, and it actually is a friend. It's not me. Um, uh, and he often had some issues about sex. I won't go into all of them, but he was heterosexual. He was married, had a kid. And one time I remember he told me, Dan, I'm just not attracted to black women. I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, I'm just not turned on by them. And I said, wait a minute. I said, so you're telling me if you weren't married and you came home one night and there was Halle Berry or some other gorgeous black woman laying in your bed naked saying, do me, big boy, you wouldn't be on it? And he said, oh, well, of course I would. And I said, well, what, she's not black? He said, oh, no, but it's Halle Berry. And I said, so what are you talking about? So after talking for a few minutes, it came out that he just wasn't attracted to dark-skinned black women who are overweight and have big, thick lips. And I said, so you don't want to fuck Aunt Jemima? And that was the basic thing. And now here's an example. And he had 2 degrees. He was well educated or whatnot. And to me, this is the perfect example of someone who uh, is has a negative thing, but it's not because he's necessarily a mal person. He's not an evil. He's just ignorant. And I think oftentimes you get mixed up with ignorance versus sort of actively evil. I've known many, for example, bigots. Most of my family, I'm adopted, but my dad was a very open-minded person. But most of the rest of the family, they would talk about Dr. Martin Luther King and things like this. But they would be very good to each other. They weren't abusive. They weren't, wife batterers or whatnot. What do you? What is your take in general about people that have these misconceptions regarding sex? To get back to my friend, and yet they're not bad people, but there's just something missing. Is it just a matter of education or what?
Yeah, yeah. So sex is so interesting because on the one hand, it is intensely personal. It is very intimate. On the other hand, I think we have a lot of inherited ideas from our society about the kind of person you should be attracted to you and what it says about you if you're attracted to someone else. So I think a lot of these ideas like, oh, I wouldn't date a so and so person, I wouldn't date a black person, I wouldn't date a fat person, I wouldn't date a whatever person. Um, I think those are informed by who has power and who has desirability. Like I've heard the term desirability politics recently, and it's this idea that there is power in attributing to desirability to certain populations over others. Because if you look at what people are watching in terms of porn when they don't think anyone's paying attention, people are attracted to all kinds of bodies. Like there is no rule. Like there are patterns for sure, but there is porn featuring all bodies, like all humans experience all kinds of attraction, but will they admit to it is the question. So I think it really comes to what's seen as legitimate partnerships and ideal partnerships, and if you are with the right kind of attractive person, or if there's like social power and they're like, oh, I don't want to date an immigrant, a black person, a disabled person. It's because we're worried it says something about us. that we're dating someone who's not seen as conventionally attractive or desirable.
Well, I think for me, the thing with his claim about not being attracted to black women wasn't, I mean, I think it's legitimate. If you said to me, Dan, I just don't like uh, Iranian or Muslim men or something because of the way they treat women or something. I mean, I think that's defensible. Obviously, there are going to be some good Muslim men and some bad ones. But to me, it was his conflation of all black women with Aunt Jemima versus not rather than seeing a real black one, you either had the gorgeous Hollywood movie star in Halle Berry, or you had the stereotype, and there was that to me was the thing that he went wrong. Not that he because if you're going to say, well, I only like men, or I don't think you can say that. If someone says, I'm only attracted to men if they're gay, a gay male, you can't then turn around and say, well, if I'm only attracted to Asian women, say, which is a common fetish, I guess, fetishized about by a lot of straight men. I don't think you can slag on the one person who's attracted to just Asian women, can you? Without there being hypocrisy.
Yeah, no, I mean I would agree. There's a sort of like low key, low level like bigotry, racism, assumption, stereotyping. And I agree. I think it's sadly common, and it's not like these people are going to go put on Klan robes at the end of the day after making a statement like that. But obviously, we should try to eradicate racism wherever we find it. So it's complicated. It's weird. I don't really understand that myself.
So just a couple of other things just to toss out some odds and ends before we end this. Uh, One of the over the last 50 or 60 years, and I know you've written about folklore and psi phenomena, unexplained phenomena, that kind of thing. You have an interest in all that kind of thing, from what I've read. To me, one of the biggest kind of sexual bizarre things that has occurred in the last 60 years is what's known as the alien abduction phenomenon. And a lot of this has to do with, I guess, the old sea hag or succubi, incubi, sleep paralysis, this kind of thing. But it seems clear to me that since we know, legally speaking, that eyewitness testimony is terrible, and that you can have the most obvious things, a classroom, someone runs in and steals something off the professor's desk, people will see many different things. That when you have something as archetypal as these fetal gray aliens with big eyes, that has to be internally generated in some way. And I've always wondered, and I don't know if you know, why hasn't the alien abduction phenomenon been studied as a sexual phenomenon rather than an unexplained phenomenon? Or has it been?
That's a great question. I'm struggling to think of any scholarship right now, but there is one sort of like longer term puzzle piece as well, which is that all throughout medieval Europe, up through Renaissance and early modern times, there were stories of people being abducted by the Fae, by the folk under the hill, by the fairies, by the elves. So I think that the alien abduction stories are just one more kind of reiteration of these fairy abduction legends that were so popular. Now there didn't seem to be a sexual component to the fairy legends, like that's new in this iteration of the urban legend. But there was sometimes some sex. Like oftentimes a mortal woman was called to be midwife to the fairies. Fairies are notoriously bad at giving birth safely, I guess. Or the fairies would swap a human child for a fairy child, and the fairy child would be raised as a changeling, essentially. So they're like sex kind of shows up, but not as an explicit motif in these stories. So yeah, I mean, my brief take on this would be that again, these stories are a long part of tradition, and they're just being reframed with the motif of the day, in this case, the alien rather than the fairy. I think the sex part comes in because there are a lot of anxieties about sexuality. I think people are worried about being monitored. People are worried about surveillance, things like that. So I think it all just kind of comes together into like, what is the epitome of invasive technology? Well, it would invade your body because our bodies are seen as very like private and covered up in the U.S.
I wanted to speak momentarily of Christian mythology and sex. And I use the term mythology because I'm not religious. So if you're religious, I apologize if I offend you by simply calling it mythology and not religion. But it seems to me that there's a lot of, I don't know what you'd call it, sexual violence porn in relation to a lot of biblical stories. The two that strike me the most is the story. I think it's Abraham who wants to sacrifice his son Isaac, for God's pleasure, and then obviously the the agonistus of Christ supposedly on the cross, which was taken to its most, I guess, violent porn efforts by what's his face, Mel Gibson in his movie about the Passion of the Christ. Um, do you see, or have you ever, do you know of any research done into sexual mythos and violent sexual mythos within the Christian religion or other religions too, Abrahamic or not?
Yeah, that's a great question.
I try.
Yeah, I know there's been research. It's not my main area, but I do have friends and colleagues in religious studies who look for these types of things. And I know there's been some work on medieval iconography and medieval saints, which also often have a very like kind of sexual and violent depiction. But yeah, I agree. I mean, if you look at, and I'm not offended by the word myth. In fact, that's how we would use it. It's a sacred origin story, whether or not you
Yeah.
believe in it. It's just a category of narrative.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at even like the virgin conception of Jesus
Mm.
Christ, like, is that consensual? I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's just there's a lot of that stuff kind of baked into Christianity again at the biblical level, where consent is just not so much a thing.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, Leda and the Swan is the obvious example. You know,
Mhm.
I, um, but uh, yeah, it always seems too that, and again, it's been many years since I read the Bible, the King James version, at least 30 years or so. It seems that sex in the Bible is always treated as something that men have to use some kind of subterfuge or force. There seems to be very little in the way of, I guess you would call it just plain old vanilla male female relations. The sexual relations within the Bible seem to always be at the crux of some kind of the center of some kind of tale or something, and usually it involves subterfuge or violence. Am I correct in that? It,
I haven't read the Bible in years either,
uh,
so that sounds about right.
uh,
But I mean, yeah, looking out to like medieval saints legends and things like that. Yeah, sex is a topic of great violence, shame, metaphysical things happening. And unfortunately, I do think we see a lot of this sort of Christian worldview about sex today in the US in terms of how sex education is being framed and taught or not taught, as in the case of abstinence only education, this idea that sex is inherently shameful, sinful, dirty, all these things. I think that's a really pervasive outlook. And I think in part we can blame Christianity because, Judaism has I think, neutral, healthy-ish outlook on sex. Some forms of Islam do too. And secular people, like, what does sex mean? I don't know. It's just a biological act that sometimes we have emotional feelings about. Okay. So there's no reason to have all this furor and uproar about sex education unless you have a Christian worldview, in my opinion.
so let me just ask a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up. Um, One of the things too that I wanted to speak a little bit earlier, but I glossed over, was that a lot of times in the last 20 years you hear the term cancel culture, and this isn't a particularly sexual question, but I just would like to get your opinion on it. I find it kind of odd, ahistorical, and sometimes even funny when I hear people on the right talking about cancel culture. And I'm not saying that I agree with everything that the political left does. I think a lot of times they do things very stupidly. They don't. They're not as passionate as, or they're not as focused as they should be on the things like we talked about with the gay marriage lawyers and how good they were. And I think, well, cancel culture, okay, you want to talk about cancel culture, why don't we talk about the original cancel cultures, actual literal witch hunts, and then the Red Scares after World War One and World War Two. If this wasn't cancel culture, what is cancel culture? And even cancel culture now just means that for a few months your YouTube following drops. You're not out of a job for 20 years because you were once a communist 20 years earlier. What is your take on cancel culture and the hypocrisy of that term and the outrage from, I guess we call more conservative areas?
Yeah, I completely agree. It's utterly lacking in historical context. Like, hey, have you heard of McCarthyism? Kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And I see the same thing when people on the right start crying out about free speech and things like that. Like, I was on the UC Berkeley campus teaching when Milo Yiannopoulos came to town in
Uh,
2017. There was a lot of outcry about free speech. And it's like, you're not being thrown in jail. You are not being beat up. Like, I could point you to any number of fascist regimes, both past and present, where free speech is not guaranteed by the government and has serious consequences and could land you in prison or worse. This is more speech has consequences, and if people don't like what you're saying, they don't have to listen to you or support you.
yeah. Wasn't he canceled, Milo, by people? I mean, he's not as big as he was a few years ago.
Yeah, the talk was canceled. There was a protest. There was a bunch of stuff, but like it's the thing that I don't get about him in particular is he's a gay man working with white supremacist fascists. They're going to turn on him eventually. They're just using him for as long as it's convenient because white supremacy is rooted in heterosexist eugenics, essentially. So, like, they have no reason to befriend queer people unless they think they can get some use out of them.
Well, yes, I feel the same about Thomas Sowell, and even more so about Clarence Thomas. But um, final thought, and this goes to folklore. I've mentioned this. There was this girl I interviewed a month or so ago, a 15-year-old girl, a really terrific filmmaker from Britain, and I was just wondering, as a folklorist and mythos and all of this stuff, symbolism, have you ever heard of a filmmaker named Maya Deren?
Mm-mm.
Okay, because I just I recommended it to this young girl, and I would recommend you watch her. She only did about 6 or 7 films in her lifetime, though none were more than maybe about 15 minutes, and they're very dreamlike. They most of them, except for one, didn't have any sound to it, and she's considered one of the, I guess, the foremother of American avant-garde cinema, long before Warhol, long before other people like that. So I was just wondering if you had seen it. Maybe by the next time we speak or speak about your book, you Google that and watch it, because I'd be interested to hear your opinions on her. But anyway, I will link to your website. What is it?
F.com.
GinaJorgensen.com/WordPress. And anyone can find you there. It was a terrific conversation. Do you have any final thing you want to say before we go?
I don't think so. Thanks for having me.